Welcome to segment 4 of our series entitled America Under Fire, The Old Guy Speaks. In this segment, we'll be covering reserve currencies. We turn now to the great blessings and advantages that have accrued to America for 80 to 100 years as a result of our dollar being the world's reserve currency used in international trade. Since World War I or World War II, depending on which yardstick you prefer. The world has had a global reserve currency since about the 15th century, based on which Western nation was the leading power in international trade. That nation's currency became the dominant currency used in trade worldwide, and in recent times, nearly the only currency so used. That still holds, at least for now, but the U.S. dollar is weakening in that role. Let's start with some perspective, some background, a rundown of global reserve currencies that have existed. And you'll find that these currencies belong to whatever was the dominant Western seafaring power over the years. From the year 1450 to 1530, the world's reserve currency was the Portuguese real for 80 years. From 1530 to 1640, the Spanish dollar reigned for 110 years. From 1640 to 1720, it was the Dutch guilder for 80 years. From 1720 to 1815, the French franc was the reserve currency for 95 years. From 1815 to 1920, the British pound sterling was the reserve currency for 105 years. Then beginning in either 1920 or 1945, depending on which yardstick you prefer, since that time the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency. Using the World War I yardstick, we've had the world's reserve currency for 104 years, using the World War II yardstick for 79 years. Up through the pound sterling, the reserve currencies averaged 94 years. So the dollar's not into overtime yet, but the era of dollar dominance may be nearing its twilight. Some nations have come to have a beef with the U.S., asserting that the world's reserve currency should be used very sparingly as a means of sanctioning other nations, not weaponizing it. For instance, our sanctions on Russia when it invaded Ukraine. We froze over $300 billion in U.S. dollars held by Russian banks, I think for international trade. And as I speak, we were still threatening to take custody of that $300 billion, even though it belongs to Russia, and to give at least part of it to Ukraine. That's the kind of power that comes with owning the global reserve currency. But we may soon reap the whirlwind. Other nations are now actively developing workarounds that will avoid the need to use the U.S. dollar in international trade. This is known as de-dollarization. For example, in March of 2023, the 10 nations of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, Indonesia, and 9 others, agreed to abandon the use of the dollar for trade among themselves. But the leading example of de-dollarization in international trade is the BRICS nations, BRICS, meaning Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Together, they constitute about 30% of global GDP, which is impressive in itself. And they've been collaborating with 19 other nations to reduce their reliance on the US dollar by creating a new global trade settlement currency that I believe will be digital. At their August 2023 meeting, the BRICS admitted 6 of those 19 nations to BRICS membership: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, United Arab Emirates. So we now have 11 BRICS Plus nations and 13 other direct collaborators developing those workarounds. It's projected that by 2030, the BRICS Plus and the developing economies will surpass the combined GDP of the Western nations. I personally see handwriting on the wall. Having the world's reserve currency greatly enriches a nation and has made our U.S. standard of living the best in human history, but has also allowed the U.S. to run budget deficits for decades to spend more than it takes in. De-dollarization just on its own will make America less wealthy. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell is quoted as stating in June of 2023 that, quote, a U.S. CBDC could help maintain the dollar's international standing. Now, that could potentially be true, and it could be a positive, but only if the U.S. creates a new CBDC for use solely in international trade. But, spurred on by that success, you can bet that the Fed and the Treasury Department would seek a congressional blessing to unleash a CBDC to replace all the dollars in our accounts, with the catastrophic consequences as stated earlier. The CBDC symptoms are starting to show. We're seeing businesses become cashless, taking credit or debit cards only. At some major sports venues, you'll now see reverse ATMs, where you must exchange your cash for a debit card. And I've read that a U.S. company has been awarded a patent for a machine of that type, a reverse ATM, to exchange your paper money for electronic money. And it has an interesting feature: a built-in shredder or other device that will permanently destroy the paper dollars you inserted. Advocates would say, well, that makes sense by not increasing the amount of currency in circulation. But it sure bothers me, personally, to trade even paper currency for electronic currency, controlled by unknown and corruptible forces somewhere out there in the ether. Let me move on now from reserve currencies to close this overall money-related discussion with a quote from Mr. Lee Bellinger, who publishes a newsletter with financial and other life advice. Quote, unfortunately, the only true solution to ending state-driven capitalism and restoring free markets in the long haul is the total involuntary collapse of the federal government's spending debt bubble. I sure hope he is wrong on that. And that's where we'll leave it for now. We have completed our 3 segments on the U.S. dollar. We're at a major break point. When we come back, we'll be going on to other topics, which you can see listed on our link page. The first 2 of these topics will be climate change and pandemics. They come under the general heading of depopulation. So thank you, and we hope to see you back shortly for the next segment.